Hello, Chautauqua! I'm so excited to be back here in this sacred space, this magnificent auditorium that's been the source of so much light and learning over the years. And I'm so excited to talk with you this morning about a reading project that changed my life. It happened during COVID. It changed the way I thought about how to be a good person and how to be a good citizen, how I understood the foundation of American democracy, and it also created in me an evangelical dedication to be part of a movement for lifelong learning around America. As it happens, that's exactly the mission of the Chautauqua movement, and that's why it's so meaningful to be here in this space to talk to you this morning. So let me tell you about the unusual COVID reading project that led me to set out to read the books of ancient moral philosophy that inspired the founders when they wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, "the pursuit of happiness." It was a series of unexpected synchronicities that led me to realize that both Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson had chosen as the source of their understanding of the pursuit of happiness a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. Here's what happened. First, I was rereading the section of Ben Franklin's autobiography where he describes how in his 20s he resolved to achieve moral perfection. He'd been reading the ancient philosophers, Cicero and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, and he decided to come up with a spiritual self-accounting system. He made a list of 12 virtues: prudence, temperance, cleanliness, order. He saved the one he found hardest for last, humility. And he made a grid with the virtues on the x-axis and the days of the week on the y-axis, and he decided every week to choose a different virtue to focus on, and every night to put an X mark in the box next to that virtue where he'd fallen short. He tried this for a while. He found it was incredibly depressing, and he eventually abandoned the project, but he decided that he was a better man for having tried. Now, as it happens, I knew about Ben Franklin's Virtue Project because about a decade ago, a rabbi in Washington, D.C., suggested that a friend and I try the Franklin system, which had been translated into Hebrew in the 19th century. It turns out that there was a Hasidic rabbi who admired Franklin and translated his virtues into Hebrew and offered them up as a system of self-improvement called Musar, which means character improvement. And my friend and I tried this system without realizing that it had come from Franklin. And every night we put an X mark next to the virtue where we fell short. We tried it for a while. We found it's incredibly depressing. And we also gave it up after just a few weeks. And like Franklin, we felt that we were better for having tried. So I knew the system. What I didn't know is that Franklin chose as the motto for his Virtues Project a phrase from the Cicero book called the Tusculan Disputations. And it said, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." Okay, a few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville, Virginia, on the beautiful University of Virginia campus. And in the room of the hotel was a list of 12 virtues that Thomas Jefferson had drafted for his daughters. I hadn't seen this list before. It looked surprisingly like Franklin's system in many respects. It had virtues like silence, when angry, count to 10. When very angry, 100. Or resolution, resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. Now, Franklin had only 12 virtues. Jefferson left one of Franklin's virtues off his list, and that was chastity. So I was struck by Jefferson's virtues, but then I was blown away to learn that when Jefferson was asked what the secret of happiness was and how to practice these virtues, he would send a passage from the Tusculan Disputations, this Cicero book that I'd never heard of. And the passage said, "He who has achieved a tranquility of soul, who is neither unduly exuberant or unduly despondent, he has achieved the calm self-mastery of which we are in quest. He is the happy man." Okay, so both Franklin and Jefferson choose Cicero to illustrate their understanding of happiness, not as the pursuit of pleasure, but the pursuit of virtue. I thought, I've got to read this Cicero book to understand this classical definition of happiness. But what else to read? Then I found a golden reading list that Thomas Jefferson would send to anyone who asked when he was old. People were writing to him all the time, and he would send this to the sons of his friends who were going to law school or to people who wanted to be educated. And the reading list is extraordinary, both in its scope and the rigor of the schedule that it sets out to read the books. It includes sections on literature. Jefferson loved novels like Lawrence Sterne. It includes political philosophy and history. My eye was drawn to the section on moral philosophy. At the top of the list was Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, and then other classical Greek and Roman moral philosophers, Marcus Aurelius's Meditation, Seneca's Letters, Epictetus, and then Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke and Francis Hutcheson and Lord Bolingbroke and David Hume. The first thing that struck me is that I had not read most of the books on this list. I've had the privilege of an extraordinary liberal arts education, and I am grateful every day to the marvelous teachers that I had in high school and college and law school, and please applaud them because we must be grateful for our teachers. They are the apostles of light to the next generation, and they live with us each day, and each day I feel the spark that these great teachers kindled in me. And I studied in English. In college, I was an English and government major, and I studied politics and political philosophy and history and law with these marvelous teachers, but I never read these great works of moral philosophy because they'd fallen out of the curriculum by the time that I was in college in the 80s. And in college, I remember yearning for this kind of guidance. It was the 1980s, it was the greed is good decade, and I was looking for an alternative to the materialism and hedonism that was celebrated by popular culture. I was an English major, and I was studying Puritan theology. And that just wasn't doing it for me. First of all, because it's very rigorous in saying that no amount of good works even can save us. It's only God's randomly given grace. Plus, I'm Jewish. So I was craving an answer to the question of, can the good life be led by reason and reflection rather than by simple authority? And what I didn't realize, because these marvelous books had fallen out of the curriculum, is that this is exactly the question that the classical moral philosophers were set out to answer. The other thing that was so inspiring about Jefferson's reading list is he's very demanding about what you have to read and how long you have to spend each day reading. You have to get up before sunrise, spend 2 hours reading moral philosophy, watch the sunrise, read political philosophy and history, then lunch, then science and astronomy and some light philosophical investigations, then dinner, then you're allowed some Shakespeare and poetry, and then to bed, up the next day, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, no excuses. So I really don't know what came over me, but it was COVID, and we all have more time. And I really felt I've got to read this Cicero. So I did it. I got up every morning before sunrise, read for an hour or two in the moral philosophy, watched the sunrise, and then I found myself writing sonnets to sum up the wisdom that I'd read, which I know is a practice that sounds incredibly weird. But I'd been inspired to start writing some poetry The year before, my wife Lauren, as you heard, is here. She is both a cultural anthropologist and a brilliant poet. Please come this afternoon to hear her on The Goddess. And she just gave me the confidence to think that if I opened myself up to poetry, I could do it. So, and I also felt it would be useful just to sum up the wisdom in condensed form. But then I found, to my great surprise, that all sorts of people in the founding era would read this moral philosophy and write sonnets, including, most significantly, Phillis Wheatley, the first published black poet, the great Phillis Wheatley, and also the founding fathers wrote light sonnets. Alexander Hamilton wrote them, the great Mercy Otis Warren, and then John Quincy Adams would get up in the White House, read Cicero in the original, especially the Tusculan Disputations, write sonnets, walk along the Potomac, and watch the sunrise. So there's something in this beautiful material that just craves to be distilled in harmonious form. So that's what I did. I did it for a year. I read the books on Jefferson's reading list, and what I read and learned changed my life. And what I discovered is that indeed, as Cicero said, for the founders, happiness, and in particular the pursuit of happiness, meant not feeling good but being good. And being good means the pursuit not of immediate pleasure but of long-term virtue. And by virtue they had something particular in mind. Self-mastery, self-improvement, character improvement, being your best self, using every moment of the day to use your powers of reason to moderate or modulate your unreasonable passions and emotions so that you can achieve the calm tranquility that defines well-being and happiness, that tranquility of soul that Cicero referred to. I discovered that for the founders, happiness was a constant battle between reason and passion. Logos, reason; pathos, passion. We must use our powers of reason to moderate our unreasonable passions and emotions. The classical philosophers are not against emotion. They just think that some emotions are productive and others are unproductive, and we need to achieve the golden mean. This distinction between reason and passion turns out to come from Pythagoras, of all people, who knew that in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, if that weren't enough, he also was a guru who lived on the Isle of Croton and encouraged his disciples to first be good and then live like gods. And they could live like gods by achieving rigorous self-discipline and self-mastery in eating and drinking and thought and learning. He was a demanding vegetarian. Ovid's Metamorphosis in the famous 15th chapter has a great chapter on Pythagoras' vegetarianism. With an unusual exception, Pythagoras prescribed the eating of beans. He was so serious about this injunction that his disciples would rather die than eat a bean. And once the disciples were running from an enemy general, and he was about to kill them because they came upon a bean field, and they stopped because they'd rather die than tread on the bean field. And the general says, "Just one thing, I'll spare your life, just tell me, why won't you eat beans?" And the disciples said, "I'd rather die than tell you." And she spit out her tongue and perished rather than tread on the bean field. So why on earth wouldn't they eat beans? Well, the philosophers, the authorities are divided on this. Some think it is because beans resemble fetuses and they have the spirit of life in them. Others think that beans produce spirits which are then expelled from unclean orifices. And the dispute was never exactly resolved. But regardless, just don't touch the beans. Other than that, vegetables are good. So that's Pythagoras. But far more significantly than his vegetarianism is that he comes up with the foundation of Greek moral philosophy. And he imagines reason in the head and pathos or desire in the heart, pathos or emotion in the heart and desire in the stomach. And these three faculties or powers have to be used to balance each other. Plato then popularizes Pythagoras' three-part division into his metaphor of the charioteer. And the charioteer, representing reason, has two horses, the noble and appetitive horse, and his job is to exert reason to ensure that both horses pull in the same direction. So it's this notion of the harmony of the soul that doesn't allow reason or passion to predominate, but achieves a balance between them. The wisdom was made concrete for me by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who told me that her mother, who'd read this great wisdom in New York City public schools at the turn of the century, when as an immigrant, her mother, fleeing pogroms and oppression in Eastern Europe, was such a reader that she would walk down the streets of the Lower East Side, and she once broke her nose because she ran into a wall because she was buried in a book. That just sums up the devotion to reading of that extraordinary generation of Jewish immigrants. And Justice Ginsburg's mother would always tell her, overcome unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They are not productive, and they will distract you from crucial work. And that's the classical wisdom, to avoid anger, jealousy, and fear, or avarice and ambition, the classical vices, so you can achieve the classical virtues of temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. These are all virtues of the soul. Another way to look at it in modern terms, it's all a version of the marshmallow test. Remember that experiment at Stanford in the 70s? Kids are given a choice. If they want one marshmallow, they can have it immediately. If they can wait for 15 minutes, they can get 2 marshmallows. It turns out that the kids who could wait did better later in life. They had better life outcomes, and that form of impulse control, of resisting the immediate gratification in order to serve your long-term interest, is the classical definition of virtue. And what's so remarkable about reading the primary text is that this definition of the pursuit of happiness, first of all, the phrase itself appears everywhere. It's not some esoteric invention of Thomas Jefferson, but it's in all the moral philosophy. And not only the Greeks and Romans, but also in the Christian sources, Wollaston and Tillotson and all of the so-called reasonable Christian ministers of the time. It's in the Whig protest literature like Cato's Letters. It's in the classical Republican literature, as well as in the 4 sources that Jefferson identified as his main inspirations for the Declaration: John Locke, Algernon Sidney, and Aristotle, and Cicero. Jefferson said, I wasn't inventing the Declaration, I was distilling the principles of the American mind in these great philosophers, and he meant it, and that's why the phrase appears everywhere, and it's all about virtue and impulse control and the pursuit of long-term self-mastery. One technical but important point. Why did Jefferson say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and not life, liberty, and property? After all, John Locke's second treatise says we're all born in a state of nature with certain natural rights, including life, liberty, and property. For a long time, people have assumed that property is just a synonym for happiness. But it's not. There's a technical reason. Property, unlike the pursuit of happiness, is an alienable natural right. When we move from the state of nature to form governments, says John Locke, we surrender or alienate certain natural rights in order to get greater security and safety of the rights we've retained. Obviously, we have to alienate the right to exchange property to make an economy possible, and government has to be able to enforce violations against property. By contrast, the right to pursue happiness can't be alienated because it's based in our powers of reason. And we have not only a right, but a duty to exercise our powers of reason and our freedom of conscience, which is synonymous with the pursuit of happiness. And Jefferson says in this beautiful passage, the opinions of men, being dependent on evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot be controlled by other men. In other words, I can't alienate to you the power to control my thoughts because I can't alienate my power of reason. It's inherent in who I am, and I have not only a right but a duty to exercise it. So that's why happiness is unalienable, and that's why the Declaration reads as it does. Now I want to tell you about how some of the founders applied this wisdom in their own lives. That's what the book is about. It has chapters focusing on different founders and their efforts to achieve different virtues. And it's striking that in so many respects, they fell short of their ideals. But what's also striking is how mindful they were about their quest. They're constantly beating themselves up about not working hard enough, or reading enough, or eating too much, or that amazing moment when John Quincy Adams says, you know, I'm 30 years old, he's turned down a Supreme Court appointment, he's a minister to St. Petersburg, and he says, I'm just squandering my time. I'm spending too much time at the theater. I'm getting fat. If only, he said, if I had a little more self-discipline, I might have ended war and slavery. He set a very high bar for himself. But it's that constant sense that you've got to work harder to use every moment of the day for productive self-improvement that is really the most inspiring part of the founders. He got it from his mom and dad. I thought having a Jewish mom was tough. It turns out, imagine having a Puritan mother in Abigail Adams, because she's constantly exhorting him to use your powers of reason to subjugate your passions. She loves to quote the proverb, he who is slow to anger is greater than he who's conquered a village, and John Quincy imbibes that lesson. The first chapter is about John and Abigail Adams, who have one of the great courtships and intellectual friendships in American history. When they meet, inspired by Pythagoras, they decide to make a list of each other's faults, which is not a good dating strategy, I can assure you. But they make the lists and they do the check marks. And Abigail is very generous, and she said, well, your fault is, you know, you're so brilliant that some people find you intellectually intimidating, some fault. And he says, well, your fault is that you should practice the piano more and read more, plus you're pigeon-toed. And she, with great self-possession, says, I'll try to practice more and read more, but a gentleman shouldn't comment on a lady's posture. So despite that beginning, they go on to have one of the great marriages and epistolary friendships of American history. And much of Adams' virtue work during the marriage and otherwise is on humility. He knows that he's one of the most self-regarding men of his age. You'll remember from the musical 1776, I'm obnoxious and disliked, that cannot be denied. You know, he's constantly storming that he's not getting enough credit for the revolution. You know, Adams was the man on the committee. Adams should get the credit. He speaks of himself in the third person. He would go on rampages and throw his wig down on the floor and trample on it. Franklin said of him, he's a man who's candid, honest in all respects, and a little bit mad. Because he was so self-focused. But he is ultimately so relatable and so endearing because he's aware of his vices and he struggles to overcome them. He has a really inspiring friendship with Mercy Otis Warren, the great anti-federalist, sister of James Otis, who denounced the writs of assistance. She gets a great classical education. She's not allowed to go to university. Women are not in those days. But with her brother James, she studies the classics and becomes what Adams calls the poetical genius of the Revolution. He commissions her to write satires making fun of the Boston Tea Party. They're a national hit. They go viral. She then aligns with Jefferson in the election of 1800 and writes a really brilliant history of the United States, one of the first ever written, but from an anti-federalist Jeffersonian perspective. Adams takes offense, in particular, at her claim that he's vain and a monarchist, which is the standard Jeffersonian claim against the Federalist. Adams says, how dare you call me vain? She says, all your friends know you are. I'm not a monarchist, but you praise the British Constitution. So they stop talking for a while. Abigail sends a lock of her hair to make up. They reconcile. They have this beautiful forgive and forget. And then Mercy Otis Warren says, I've got just one favor to ask. Some guy's taken credit for my play, The Adulator, in the Boston Athenaeum. He's put his name on the title page. You're the only one who know I wrote it. Can you certify that? Adams says, absolutely. You're the only genius who could have written this play. Gets on a horse, rides into Boston, goes to the Athenaeum, and writes on the title page, this was written by Mercy Otis Warren. And if you go to the Athenaeum today, you can see Adams' testimony, which is also a tribute to his capacity for friendship and forgiveness, and ultimately humility. The other great reconciliation of Adams' life is his reconciliation with Thomas Jefferson. Friends, we are living in extraordinarily challenging times for American democracy. Think of how challenging they were in 1800, when the Republic almost fell because first it wasn't clear who won the election. The crucial point there, Adams accepts the election results. That was very important. And he, though doesn't talk to Jefferson for a decade after the election, once again they reconcile. Benjamin Rush brings them together, and then they have the most moving epistolary friendship in all of American letters. And what do they want to talk about when they're old men? The books they've read. And in particular about their spiritual growth. And it's extraordinarily moving, first to see how eager they are to get access to books. And Adams is so excited when he learns that Pythagoras, the inventor of Greek moral philosophy, may have traveled to the East and read the Hindu Vedas. And he says that once it's clear that Pythagoras studied the Vedas, then all will realize that the core wisdom of the Stoics is similar to that in the Bhagavad Gita. The Stoics have the dichotomy of control, focus on the only thing you can control, which is your own thoughts and emotions. We are what we think, life shaped by the mind. And the Gita says, in a passage Gandhi loved to quote, renounce and enjoy. Renounce attachment to external events and enjoy eternal peace and salvation. And Adams, with his close reading, immediately saw the deep connection among those two traditions and think it'll be proved if only evidence of Pythagoras' journey can be established. And Adams is so excited when he learns that Joseph Priestley is just completing a comparison of the moral philosophy of Christians and Hindus, because the Gita has just been translated, but he's not sure Priestley has lived long enough to complete the book. Jefferson says, good news, he's lived, I'll send you the book from Paris, and Adams is just thrilled that he's going to be able to establish this connection. What a mark of lifelong learning that these two great men, with all that they've achieved and all of their successes and failures, never stop in their devotion to continuing to explore truth. And Adams sums up his mature spirituality in the hymn of Cleanthe, which is a classical hymn which he translates as love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. And Jefferson says at the end of his long life, he's concluded that he's no longer a Stoic, but an Epicurean. But he means by you laugh, but Jefferson says it's a libel on Epicurus to imagine him as a hedonist, as a wanton pleasure seeker. That was the libel of the Stoics on Epicurus. In fact, our master, Epicurus, as Jefferson calls him, said that we should rationally contract our desires so that we can virtuously meet them. In other words, you don't seek no pleasure as the Stoics do. That's unrealistic. But you seek rational and virtuous pleasures. And that was Jefferson's settled philosophy. Now, friends, we must address the crucial question, what about Jefferson and slavery? How is it possible that this founder, like all the founders who insisted that virtue was the key to happiness, could have so flamboyantly and notoriously betrayed their own ideals when it came to slavery? And one thing I discovered is that they didn't even try. All of the enslavers from Virginia of the founding generation, unlike their successors in the antebellum era, insisted that slavery violated the Bible and natural law. And there's this remarkable passage from Patrick Henry when he's just given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, which is a quotation from Cato's Letters, the classical work by Addison that all the founders loved. And Henry says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I will not justify it, I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed. I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." Oh my God, you say. Well, it's the truth. He was just blurting out the truth. Oh my God, I know it's wicked and wrong and immoral, but I like the lifestyle and I don't want to give it up. And that's what they knew, and that's what they did. And they didn't try to excuse it, and they were tortured by it. And Jefferson says, "I tremble for my country when I realize that God is just." However, he might tremble, but he did not lift a finger to disturb his comfortable lifestyle during his life, and he lives like a Roman emperor at Monticello, filling the place with French footstands and gilded mirrors, and he's a shopaholic, and he's served in his home by his own kids. the people who are serving him in his house are Eden and Beverly Hemings, his kids by Sally Hemings, who are right in his house. And Sally Hemings, who he started his sexual relationship with when she was 16 and he was 40, in his 40s, agrees to return from Paris and come back to America on the condition that Jefferson free their children when he dies. And he keeps that promise. In his will, he frees Eden and Beverly. He's already allowed 2 of their other kids to run away earlier, and he frees two other Hemings relatives, no one else. The rest of his enslaved population, parents are separated from kids. The whole place has to be sold to pay his crushing debts. His whole political philosophy is based on the idea that one generation cannot pass on debts to another, and he lives so beyond his means, so violating the virtue of frugality because of his avarice, that the whole place has to be sold. In addition, as if that's not bad enough, his racism is shocking even by the standards of his time. And this I came to appreciate in learning about his relationship with the great Phyllis Wheatley. The Phyllis Wheatley story is amazing. Here's a young girl, a teenage girl, brought over in chains from Africa. And as an enslaved girl, her mistress says that she can be educated in the schoolroom along with the mistress's kids. She reads the classics, Seneca and Cicero. She starts writing these spectacular poems of virtue, which are she sends them to George Washington, who acclaims her genius. She is such a hit that the city of Boston decides to hold a trial to establish whether or not she wrote her own poems. And it's presided over by John Hancock, the guy who wrote the Declaration, signed the Declaration in big letters, and Cotton Mather and Increase and all the Boston worthies, and they examine her on her classical knowledge. And Professor Henry Louis Gates imagines the exam. Who was Apollo? Name the 9 muses. Somehow she passes, of course, with flying colors. They certify that she wrote her poems, and she becomes an international celebrity. Professor Gates calls her the Oprah Winfrey of her day. She goes to London. She meets the Duke and Duchess. She gets the key to the city. She meets with Franklin. Everyone acclaims her genius, with one exception, and that's Thomas Jefferson. And in the notes on the state of Virginia, he has a whole chapter on the poetry, on the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley, and he says it's beneath contempt because she's black and black people can't write good poetry. It's just appalling. And he has this gross section about in Rome the slaves are white, and Terence was an enslaved poet and his poems were good, but black people are inferior. It's just shocking. Again, the other founders display no similar disrespect toward her or racism toward her. She's treated very, very with honor by Washington and Franklin, and it's just a blot on the legacy of Thomas Jefferson, that he was blinded by his racism and his avarice. By contrast, think of Washington. Washington, the greatest man of his age, acclaimed because of his self-control and self-mastery. He reads Seneca as a kid, in particular Seneca's letters. The Seneca letter on time is amazing. It's the letter to Lucilius. Time is a gift repaid by industry, by squandering it. What fools these mortals be. Shakespeare's quoting Seneca. Washington becomes obsessed with time after reading Seneca, and with schedules and keeping clocks and eating and exercising and reading every day at the same moment. And he achieves his devotion to self-mastery he takes it so seriously, he's almost never observed losing his temper. He has this glacial self-control displayed to greatest effect at Newburgh in 1784, when the soldiers are going to mutiny because Congress can't pay the war debts. And the soldiers can't be paid, and they're starving and angry, and they're thinking of a coup. And Washington mounts this specially constructed wooden platform. I'm sure it looked just like this one, and it's called the Temple of Virtue. And he gets up to the Temple of Virtue. First, he has performed Addison's Cato, the play, which sums up, in Washington's favorite phrase, the consolation of mild philosophy, which comes from Cato. And then Washington goes to read his speech to the troops, but he struggles, and he puts on his reading glasses, and he says, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I've grown almost blind." And the troops weep. They've never seen Washington express weakness before. But never before has he seemed so great in this moment of self-controlled candor. And that's the key to his success at the Constitutional Convention. He doesn't say much, but it's the simple fact of his presence and his calming, self-mastered authority that allows the convention to create a strong presidency, because they know he'll be the first president, and allows the Constitution to be ratified. And then Franklin makes that crucial speech saying, "This isn't perfect, but it's as close to perfection as we're going to get, and I call for humility. And I'm asking the contending sides to set aside their differences in the recognition that unanimity is more important than perfection." All based on his classical learning. And Franklin says at the end of his life, when asked what the secret to his success is, what's his greatest achievement? This is the man who's tamed the Gulf Stream from the heavens and brought down lightning from the skies. He's acclaimed with Voltaire as the greatest man in the world. He says his greatest achievement is his conciliating temper. And he got it from his classical reading and from his mom and dad. And he learned never to be too assertive about his opinions, not to say, "I know it's this way, but I think it may be so," or "I venture perhaps," and so forth. And it's that habits of temper that Washington and Franklin thought made them great and made them want to pursue virtue. A quick beat on the Constitution and Madison and Hamilton. It's remarkable to see Madison channeling classical moral philosophy when he writes the Constitution. And in his defense in the Federalist Papers, you see that the whole thing is a defense of what Madison calls public happiness. Just as we have a responsibility as individuals to achieve harmony in the constitution of our souls between reason, passion, and desire, so the Constitution seeks to achieve the same harmony in the checks and balances of the state. And Madison creates analogies between reason, passion, and desire, the head, the heart, and the stomach, in the Senate and the executive and the judiciary. And for him, the separation of powers and checks and balances achieve the same cool reason in the state that we seek in our own minds. The central thing Madison's trying to avoid is faction, which he defines as any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. There's that reason-passion distinction again. He says, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. I'm just imagining if I were the demagogue Cleon, I could kind of egg you on and get you to be overcome by your unreasonable passions. But instead, I will summon you to cool reason by recognizing the fact that the whole Constitution is designed to stop people in large groups from becoming mobs. They're really afraid of Shays' Rebellion, that group of farmers in western Massachusetts who are mobbing the courthouses and trying to close them down. And that's why Madison says, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. The point of the Constitution is to prevent mobs from forming by slowing down deliberation, ensuring that you have to go through lots of steps before a bill can become a law, and the thought is that by the time mobs discover each other, they'll get tired and go home. Madison is also very keen on the large size of America, which will make it hard for mobs to find each other. And he's very optimistic about a new media technology, the broadside press. And he believes that when citizens read complicated primary texts like the Federalist Papers in the newspapers, and they discuss them with the help of a class of enlightened journalists that Madison calls the literati, then citizens will make up their own minds. They will think for themselves and speak as they think, to quote Tacitus, and they will be able to allow reason rather than passion to prevail. Friends, when you realize that the very core of the Republic for Madison was this cool spread of reason based in deep reading, you realize the seriousness of the challenge that we find ourselves in today. Because, of course, our new media environment of Instagram and X or whatever it's called, and Facebook is one where posts based on passion travel further and faster than those based on reason, and where the angriest tweet based on the business model of enrage to engage is one that gets the most attention, and the hope of citizens slowly and calmly reading primary sources and deliberating with people of different points of view seems quaint. That's why it is so urgently important for us together to commit to a project of lifelong learning through deep reading and to take this movement across America. And now I want to talk to you about, in very practical terms, about how this COVID project changed my life and what I would like us to do together. The biggest takeaway for me was just getting back into the habit of deep reading. I'd stopped reading books that were outside of what I needed to read for my next deadline or whatever project I had in mind. And that beautiful feeling that we all remember from college and as kids of just getting lost in books and reading for its own sake without any particular destination in mind is one that I recovered simply by this rule that I had to read for 2 hours before I was allowed to do anything else. And ever since the COVID project is over, I'm not getting up every morning to watch the sunrise, although I try when I can, but I have kept the really crucial rule that I'm not allowed to browse until I've read. And I do read on Kindle, but my rule is that I can't check email or browse until I've read for whatever my morning reading is, a half hour or an hour. And it changes your life. It's just so extraordinary. Every morning you read a book, you learn something new. When I was a kid, I was so full of wonder when I went to the Library of Congress with my mom, and for me, the most beautiful building in DC is the Thomas Jefferson building. Please go when you're next there. It has these incredible legends about the importance of reading. The fountain of wisdom flows through books, and the authors are the legislators of the universe, and it has pictures of the goddesses of literature and history. And also Eros is there as well. But it's just this temple to reading, and I was, 5 years old. I was so struck at wonder at the thought that all the books in the world were in that place. Well, here, all the books in the world are right here on this device. But you can laugh, but it's marvelous. What an extraordinary age. How fortunate we are to be living in this remarkable, miraculous age, when all the books in the world are essentially free and online. And all I need is the discipline to read them. And it's a habit, it's a practice, it's a commitment, it's a dedication to the habit of reading. So that's what I'm doing. I guess it was this morning. I was in the bookstore yesterday. I went to the Chautauqua bookstore, and there was a great book on the invention of non-sectarian spirituality in the 19th century, which I got and started reading this morning and learned that the Chautauqua movement is centrally connected to this project in the 19th century led by Emerson and others to come up with a project of lifelong spiritual self-improvement in a non-sectarian and nonpartisan way through lifelong learning. And isn't the synchronicity amazing? That literally is what the pursuit of happiness meant for the founders. And Chautauqua is founded on the principle that when citizens gather together for lifelong learning several times a day, reading and music and education and art and religion, because it is centrally a spiritual quest for self-improvement, then we can become better people. And the Chautauqua movement is based on the confidence and conviction that personal self-government is necessary for political self-government. We must first commit to improving ourselves, and then we can improve the nation and the world. And we can't govern as citizens until we first govern ourselves. It's both incredibly empowering because we all have the power every day to decide, am I going to browse and surf or read and grow? But it's also very daunting because it requires an incredible commitment on the part of citizens on a wide scale, which is why the founders weren't sure that the experiment would work. Never before in human history had large groups of citizens in a democracy committed themselves to a project of moral and spiritual perfection, self-perfection. John Quincy Adams was not alone in being daunted in the incredible duty, the obligation, the daunting need to try to use each moment of the day well so that we can achieve the self-government necessary for democracy. But it's ultimately an inspiring project, and it's impossible for all their faults not to be inspired by the extraordinary industry of the lifelong reading of the founders. And think of Adams and Jefferson excitedly trading book ideas, and then think of your experience here. And you are all lifelong learners. That's why you're Chautauquans. And you are citizens, you're nodding because you know that's true. And you're committed to, you know how important it is in your lives to learn and grow each day. And as lifelong learners, you know that there's no satisfaction like the spiritual satisfaction of learning and growing. And that's why you take the time to come here every summer and to become more perfect, to become better people. Let's together take the spirit of this space from this place across America, as the founders of Chautauqua meant to do, to inspire citizens across America to learn and grow together. Thank you so much.